There's these strange paradoxes in the community. Over 50% of the Arab community in Metro Detroit lives in poverty. So it's a very educated group, but also living in a lot of poverty. Now we're going to add a Middle Eastern North African box on every single federal agency's forms that collects race and ethnicity data in this country.
We don't have to be white anymore.
We're not going to be white. We're going to have a better understanding of our community than we ever thought possible.
Your Christianity. When someone says Arab, their head goes straight, oh, this guy's Muslim. For you, how did that translate here?
I don't know the first time I met an Arab Muslim. I only knew of Arab Christians. And then when I moved to Michigan for graduate school, I had to learn a whole new way of understanding Arabness.
You did research on food and identity?
Arabs have used restaurants in the U.S. for over 100 years as a way to convince Americans to not be afraid of them. Arabs were not always the most desirable immigrants in the U.S. Their language is weird, their food is weird. And so restaurants were a very key component of Arabs building rapport with the greater community.
What can you tell us about our community that we don't know?
Oh my,
Real quick before we start, thank you so much for tuning in and giving this podcast a listen. I have to tell you that it has become my favorite thing in the world to talk to these amazing people and see that you're enjoying the conversations as well. To make this podcast bigger and better, I need to ask you for a very small favor. Subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform you're listening to or watching on, and like the episode if you enjoy what you hear. Matthew is a very unique twist to the guest lineup. Although he's a fourth generation Lebanese immigrant with grandparents that came here 100 years ago, he is fully dedicated to help Arab research in America. That sparked all types of curiosity in my head, and I wanted to hear from him first. With that being said, let's get the show started.
Welcome aboard Middle East Airlines.
والمتوجهة إلى
طيران الشرق الأوسط يرحب
مدينة القدس العربية.
Matthew, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming. Matthew, if someone's listening to this right now, just tuning in, should they keep listening?
The Arab American community, especially the one in Metro Detroit, is so important on the national stage. Researchers come from all over the globe to study the community. And I know that sounds like in a very sort of like intrusive way, but really the thoughts and feelings and experiences of the community in Metro Detroit is so important to the overall understanding of who Arabs are in the United States.
I like to start this off with a self-introduction on your part. A self-introduction in a form of self-reflection. So, Matthew, if I tell you, when you look in the mirror, who do you see? Who is that person?
Wow, it's getting deep from the start. All right. I hope I see somebody that is dedicated to the work. And the work for me is making sure that our community is respected and is represented and has a voice. And, for me, I grew up in a small Lebanese Christian community in Western Pennsylvania. And my grandparents on my mother's side came from Lebanon. And so I was raised in a very different kind of environment than a lot of people here in Dearborn or Metro Detroit, but I've always carried my ancestry and heritage with me. And so I guess I'm trying to make sure I'm making my ancestors proud and making sure the community has the full representation it deserves.
Yeah. It's interesting what you just said, because the podcast is called Not From Here. The idea was to tell stories of immigrants that came here and their struggles and how we can tie it back to our homelands. You said that your ancestors were Lebanese, and your first and last name, Matthew Stiffler, right? But and almost any time I put your name to search, Jaber was the middle name always, So it kind of gave you that like the Arabic side. But tell me more about how your ancestors came to America and the backstory of kind of what brought them here.
Yeah, of course. Where I'm from in Western Pennsylvania, it's a little town called Johnstown. And in the late 1800s, early 1900s, it had a lot of industry, steel mills and railroads. And so it brought immigrants from all over the world. And a bunch of families came from Amun, Lebanon in the north, and settled in and around Johnstown. And they came because they needed work. They came because they wanted a better life. and some of them worked in the factories, but a lot of them ended up opening stores. And my particular family, they all owned bars and taverns. So the Jaber family in my hometown owned, half a dozen bars over the course of, 5, 6, 7 decades. And so that's the kind of environment I grew up in.
Okay.
These sort of Lebanese entrepreneurs.
Yeah. So they're from your mom's side or from your dad's side?
My mom's side.
So your mom's side, how many generations ago? So are they your grandparents or great grandparents?
So my great grandparents, they came in 1900 from Amun.
Over 100 years ago.
Yeah. And, the reason I still carry it with me, even though I grew up speaking maybe 10 words of Arabic, is, I grew up in this, in the Orthodox Christian church. And at church, everybody was Lebanese or Syrian or Palestinian. And so you have, people are singing and praying in Arabic. You have Arabic food, of course, and people talking about politics in Arab countries. And so I grew up in that environment, even if it was only one day a week on Sunday. None of my other friends growing up were Lebanese or Arab. So I had this really interesting experience where, like, one day a week when I went to church, I was in a very different environment than I was the rest of the week. And so when I got to graduate school and I wanted to study American culture, I thought, what's more interesting than my own story and my own heritage? Because I had, in all of my studies as a historian up until that point, I never read anything about the Arab American community.
When you were going to church and when you were surrounded by like all these other Arab, your parents, did they kind of push you to do that, or was it kind of like, oh, I have to go there, or I get to go there?
Depends what we were going for. Okay. If we were going to sit in liturgy for 2 hours, on a Sunday morning, yeah, my mom had to drag me out of bed. But if we were going to the hafla, or if we were going to the youth group meetings where, a lot of the other folks who were like me would meet and do service projects and those kinds of things, I was much more intrigued about that stuff than sitting in church. I'm a very hyperactive young boy, and so sitting in church for 2 hours was really difficult.
Definitely. But how was the culture implemented in your household, if at all, from your mom?
Yeah, we lived in a part of Pennsylvania where everybody was from somewhere for the most part. It was a factory town, much like Dearborn. So people came from all over for work. People were from Hungary, Italy, Ukraine. My dad's mother was an Italian immigrant. And so I just grew up around a lot of different ethnicities. And so food was probably the most important way we all stayed connected. I mean, today, like, I still love Polish food, even though no one in my family is Polish, but I had it, even at school lunches, they would serve Polish food and, Italian food. And then, of course, the Arab food, kibinaye every Sunday at my grandma's house and those kinds of experiences. That's what set me apart from all of my friends.
Yeah.
Everybody was eating pizza and spaghetti, but I was the only one in my friend group who was eating kibbeh and tabbouleh and those kinds of things.
I asked that because I feel like for a lot of us here, first generation immigrants, we're really scared about the generations to come because we want them to hold on to the culture, and it's always a conversation like, hey, should we move back, like, for our kids so they can have, it's a big deal for us. Should we move back and hold on to that culture, or should we just stay here and try to preserve it as much as we can? So that's why I'm asking, because it's very interesting, like great grandparents. So your grandparents, three generations, and you're still very hands-on with the Arab culture.
Yeah, and I think this is important. Is we live in the United States, and outside of a place like Dearborn, which has such a huge Arab population, most Arab Americans grow up not around other Arab Americans. So it's harder to maintain a specific identity, but they can maintain certain things. They can maintain the music, right? They listen to the music, the food, some of the language. It's very difficult to teach, as you might know, to teach children, and then especially the next generation, the third generation, to maintain the language. But they're going to hold on to something. If it's something in your household that you celebrate, something with your families, you celebrate, that will carry on for many generations. And I'm not an exception. There's a lot of people across the country who their maybe one great grandparent came from Lebanon or Syria or Iraq, and they still hold on to that culture. They still remember sitting with their siti or their jiddo and listening to the stories and hearing the music. And so it will stick around. It's not going to look like maybe what you want it to look like, right? But it will stay there for sure.
Have you visited Lebanon?
No, I have not been to Lebanon. I've been to Jordan. I've been to Oman. I have not had the pleasure of going back. I think I'm waiting until I get enough money I can take my mom back and make it a whole big trip. And I think that would be
beautiful.
That'll be amazing.
Imagine this. Someone you care deeply about starts experiencing health issues, but the resources and treatment available for their specific needs aren't there. This is the reality for many individuals in minority communities, where healthcare research often falls short of understanding their unique experiences and challenges. We're a minority group here. That's why reaching out to the MENA community is crucial. By actively involving them in research, we can make sure that their voices are heard, their health concerns are addressed, and tailored interventions are developed to meet their needs. Visit joinallofus.org/togetheraccess or call 844-893-3908 and find out how you can take the first step in helping each other out. Your health matters, and together we can make a difference. And now, back to the episode. Very interesting other part is your Christianity, right? Because you mentioned that we live in Dearborn. When someone says Arab in front of the common American, their head goes straight, oh, this guy's Muslim. Always, almost always. You're kind of we kind of throw a blind eye, or society throws a blind eye. I know that there are Christian Arab too, right? Did you feel like, I don't want to, did you feel like pressure in a way to where like, oh my God, I'm in this community and they're all Muslim and there's not a big Christian community? Because part of our culture, we were talking about culture, is our religion is part of our culture as well. You know, Lebanon is divided into this area, or the Muslims here, and Shia Muslims are here, Sunni Muslims are here, the Christians here, Orthodox Christians it's split up that way. So that's why I'm saying it's ingrained into the culture. But for you, how did that translate here?
Yeah, growing up, I only knew Arabic-speaking folks to be Christians. I don't know the first time I met an Arab Muslim, but it was probably after college. You know, my area didn't have a lot of recent immigration from Arab countries. And so, I only knew of Arab Christians. And then when I moved to Michigan for graduate school, there's a huge Arab Christian population. Don't get me wrong. You know, you go out to Canton or Livonia, or, you know, go up to the Chaldean community, Sterling Heights, lots of Arabic-speaking Christians. But I had to learn a whole new way of, like you're saying, of understanding Arabness and what it meant to be Arab.
How did you do that?
Through research, you know. So I'm at University of Michigan. I'm getting a PhD in American culture with a focus on Arab American studies. And I had to learn not only my own history and my own community's history, but I had to learn what it meant to be Arab Muslim in the U.S. And I did that by reading, by talking to people, by getting involved in studies that interviewed and asked people about their heritage and specifically how they carry both this religious aspect and this cultural aspect. Because you're right that in many ways it's joined, but there are times where both in Arab Christianity and Arab Islam, like the religion becomes first. Yeah. And it doesn't matter what culture you are. Like if you're in that religion, you're going to believe that whatever language is coming out. And so there are times where the religion is separate. And then there's times where the culture sort of doesn't supersede the religion, but can fly underneath of it. When you talk about the traditions of music and culture and arts and hospitality, and there's these things that all Arab immigrants have brought with them, regardless of religion. And, you know, places like the Arab American National Museum here in Dearborn can celebrate that because we're a non-secular institution. And so we get to bring people together. They can still have their differences. They can still be whatever religion they want, but they can also celebrate their Arab identity in very wonderful ways.
Matthew, do you have siblings?
I have an older sister, yes.
So does your older sister live here, or does she still live in your hometown?
She lives in Nashville now, outside of
Okay.
Nashville. She actually lives in Lebanon, Tennessee.
Oh, really?
Not for any specific reason, except that's where she ended up.
Is she as close to the culture as you are?
I don't think as close. She grew up in the same environment as me. I just became, she knows the food. She knows as many words as I did growing up. And I think I just became so fascinated as a historian with how people construct who they see themselves as, and whether that's through religion or culture or the environment or geography they grow up in. I'm really fascinated by how people, not just individuals, but collective groups come up with identity. And I think just by studying it so much and being in it, I just connected with it on different levels.
What amazes you about that aspect of?
Because it can be so pervasive for people. So in one way, it can be very pervasive. Like if you present yourself as I'm an Arab, right? Like that I can sort of know a lot about you just from that. Like I might be able to guess the kind of food you like to eat or the kind of things you like to listen to. I might be able to guess your political leanings, although not always, right?
Yeah.
There's a very diverse community. But what really fascinates me about it is that although I might be able to guess those things about you, how you came to that is so unique to you. Whether it was from a family member, whether it was from studies that you did, whether it was from traveling, how you meld your Arab identity into how it becomes part of you is so individual for everybody. And it's fun to discover that.
That was your intrigue, and how did you get to where you are, thoughts wise and like just lifestyle wise? Like, why are you operating in the way that you're operating?
Yeah. So I think what happened is everybody has these fuzzy memories when they're a kid.
Mm-hmm.
And as I got older, I remember one Saturday I was at church and there was a belly dancer there and people were playing the tabla, and I'm like, why was I at church? And there was like a belly dancer. Like, so I started having these snippets of memories of like growing up in a very interesting way. And I know none of my friends had those experiences. And so I wanted to figure out where are these things coming from? And so started doing research on Arab Christianity in the U.S. and the ways that it develops its own specific brand of Arab Americanness, very different from most Muslim communities, although not completely separate. And so that to me was like trying to just recapture these memories I had of being around Arabs and Arab Americans. And one particular story still sticks with me. So our family uses the name Jaber. And there was this older guy at our church, one of these ammos who comes up to you every Sunday. He comes up to me like he's never seen me, pinches my cheeks and that kind of stuff. And he would always say, hey Jaber, your family's name is Jaber and not Jaber. They changed it to Jaber. And he would say that to me at least once a month for like 15 years. And I always just listened to it and I was like, yeah, okay, whatever. Maybe we had a different name. And then when I started doing research, I realized, yeah, we used to be Jaber and they changed it to Jaber. I have no idea when or why, but they changed it in like the 1920s. And so those kinds of like things where I was able to have these memories and then actually put them to like historical research was really fascinating to me.
Wow. So your family changed Jaber to Jaber in America?
Yeah.
So your family back home is Jaber.
Jaber, yeah.
Okay. That's interesting because there's also a Jaber family in Lebanon.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's no connection that I know of.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
How different is the Arab Christian community in your hometown versus here?
Other than the scale. So, for instance, my hometown had 25 Lebanese families.
Okay.
Whereas if you look at like the big church in Livonia, St. Mary's Basilica, has hundreds of families. So the scale is different, but it's very similar. And so I wrote in my PhD dissertation, I wrote about this. I wrote about how regardless of where in the country you are, if you're affiliated with like the Arab Christian identity, there's a lot of these similarities, and they have basis in like there's historical reasons for it. Like the way the church, the archdiocese, the Antiochian Orthodox Archdiocese might get people to celebrate their Arab heritage through church. And those sort of have cascaded down through generations. And so there is a lot of similarities with Arab Christianity across the country.
Are there differences?
Yes. And it's based on generation. So for instance, my understanding of what it means to be Arab and my mom's generation and then her parents' generation had very different understandings because you're somehow further away from what you might think of as the real Arab experience. So if you think of the real Arab experience as being in an Arab country as an Arab, and then where I'm at, which is, 4 generations later in the United States, very different understandings. And so, yes, generationally, people understand their relationship different. And that's mostly because, I didn't have the language, we didn't listen to the same kinds of folk music that people might have. But it's fascinating to see the generational changes.
Is it a big difference between the way you understand your Arabness and your mom?
No, that's pretty similar because we're both kind of grew up without speaking the language.
Right.
And we both grew up without, her dad and grandfather might have been reading Arabic newspapers or reading Arabic news from overseas. So they had a deeper connection to what was actually happening. Whereas the way me and my mom's generation understands Lebanon is like Lebanon in the 1890s. So the example I give is when I was growing up, everybody referred to the bathroom as the shushma. Like you got to go to the shushma. That's how I knew bathroom.
Yeah.
That's actually the word for outhouse.
Yeah.
Because when the people in my family came to the U.S. in 1900, that was the word for bathroom, and they didn't know any different because they never went back. And the language never evolved beyond what we understood in Johnstown, Pennsylvania.
So it kind of stopped at the 1890s.
Exactly.
Okay.
So what I found is that, yes, depending on when the people come from an Arab country, when they get to the U.S., that is sort of like sometimes where history cuts off. And what the Arabness they're celebrating is from that time period, even 3-4 generations later.
That's insane I never thought about how the language evolves within the span of 100 years across generations. Now you're making me think of how the language is when I left and probably how it's going to be when my grandparents, my grandchildren get exposed to the language.
Yeah, different words for technology, right? Technology changes so quickly. What you might call a phone 30, 40 years from now, they might have a completely different word. We might not call these smartphone devices phones anymore. They might be something else. And so you would show your age by referring into it in Arabic in a different way.
Do you think the internet's going to help with that, though? Because maybe it was difficult in 1933 to talk to family back in Lebanon, but here I can pause right now. We can call my mom and I can talk to her.
100%.
Right?
So the fact that these immigrants in 1900, except for reading some newspapers and writing some letters, were largely cut off from the homeland. Yes, definitely created like a little micro environment in that community where they spoke and used the language and the dialect of their village as it was in 1900, and it never really evolved past that.
Yeah.
And yeah, so but now it'll still happen, but it'll take a lot longer because you can still, get on WhatsApp and speak with people in Arabic back home and learn the new phrases and the new ways that they're speaking. And
the dialect changes also from area to area. So that would, like, your family would speak Arabic and refer to things a certain way, and my family would, my grandparents would, they would say different words, and they lived in the same country at the same time.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's one of the things we fight about most at the museum, because the Arab American Museum staff is made up of people of the Arabs that work there from all over, many different generations. And yeah, we're always fighting over what the name of like a food is. Oh, we call this in my household. No, it's this, and it's definitely a point of contention. In
who wins those arguments?
I don't know. It's always a fight between the Palestinians and the Lebanese over the names of foods and things. But it's hard to solve.
Yeah. How would you describe your Arabness?
Yeah, Arabness is one part of my identity, and it's a big part, but it's not everything. You know, I grew up in a very specific kind of Arabness, so I would say that I am a fourth generation Arab American whose family came from, a Christian family from Lebanon. So it's very specific.
Yeah.
Right. So you're saying, fourth generation, so it's an old Arab identity. Lebanon, it's a very specific kind of identity, but then also Lebanese Christian makes it even more specific. And so, yeah, there's so many different kinds of Arabness within the Arab American community. And I think that's important to remember. You know, there is no such thing as the Arab, like he's the Arab. That's the person that we should all be like.
Yeah.
It doesn't exist because it's such a diverse community. So we have to stop comparing, oh, you're not Arab enough, or, you're a different kind of Arab. And I think that's the point. There is no singular experience.
Especially here with all these generations. Like, I think you're the fourth generation that I've met. It's kind of people my age, first or second generation, maybe third. Fourth is kind of like, oh, wow. Like,
yeah. I actually know a few fourth generation Lebanese-American Muslims from Dearborn.
Really?
Their families came here in like the early 1900s. Maybe not to Dearborn. Maybe they went to like Michigan City, Indiana, where a lot of the Arab Muslims in Dearborn today who have been here multiple generations, their families first went to Michigan City, Indiana to build train cars because there was no car factory here yet. So there's very interesting connections. And I've met some folks who go way back.
No doubt.
In Dearborn, yeah.
Matthew, with the research within our community, I know you mentioned the research here in Metro Detroit, but I always like it to take it a step further because we are a big community here, but we're not the only community here. I never knew, or I never understood the idea of why we should research our community specifically until I met Dr. Christina Hajroush. Do you know Dr. Christina?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And she kind of explained it to me, and I'm like, this makes a lot of sense. We're so unique in our own ways in our culture, and those things make a difference to understand the needs that, like, to meet the needs that we want living here, right? To be able to provide accurate resources for the community. And I started thinking about it more and more, and it's like, why has it not been the case before? Is it simply because now we've been here for a long enough period of time to where we have a fourth generation Arab American that's thinking about, let's look at the bigger picture, or what is it exactly that has held us back until this moment?
The quick answer is that systemic change takes a long time. But yes, to make systemic change. When I'm talking about systemic change, the biggest example would be that, recently in March 2024, the federal government Office of Management and Budget said, okay, now we're going to add a Middle East or North African box on every single federal agency's forms that collects race and ethnicity data in this country.
Really?
Yes, it just happened. And that took 30 years of advocacy by Arab American and other Middle East or North African groups.
That's last month.
Just last month. After 25 years of collecting race and ethnicity data the exact same way, the federal government finally revised the standards, and part of that was adding a MENA box. So within the next 5 years, which is the deadline for federal agencies, every federal agency that collects, race and ethnicity data has to add a MENA box onto all their forms. Now that will be huge for our community.
We don't have to be white anymore.
We're not going to be white. You can still be white. You can check both. You can be white and MENA. Okay. You can be black and MENA. You can be Asian and MENA. You can be whatever you want. But we'll have data on all of that, and we'll have a better understanding of our community. And so to answer your question, people have been doing research on our community for generations. It's just the numbers were so small, and we didn't have the federal data because we were rolled into the white box. Well, now there's so many people, like so many of our community is huge. It's the largest it's ever been. It's the most diverse it's ever been. And there's more of us in like higher education as professors and researchers than there ever has been. And now that we're going to have this federal data, we're going to have a better understanding of our community than we ever thought possible.
Why is that important? If someone's listening to this and is like, why is it even important for me to check? Like, what? Who cares what I check? Why do I have to care? Or why does my mom have to care what box she checks?
On some level, it shouldn't matter, right? There's the argument, we're all human. I'm a human being. What does it matter if my ancestry is from Yemen, Iraq, Brazil, whatever? What does it matter? But in reality, the way our society works is everybody is sort of categorized, and services are delivered to communities based on who they are, and funding is allocated to communities based on who they are. And for everybody who has Middle Eastern, North African ancestry, who wants to be a part of the community, remember, this is self-identification. Nobody's forcing anybody to check this MENA box. If you feel that you're part of this coalition of identities that fit within the MENA box, by all means check it and encourage others to check it. Because what we'll then know is how big our community is, where they live, and what their needs are. From the little bit of data that's available right now, using Arab ancestry on the U.S. Census, we know that, for instance, here in Metro Detroit, there's these strange paradoxes in the community where over 50% of the Arab community in Metro Detroit lives in poverty. But if you're an Arab American in Metro Detroit, you're more likely to have a college degree than any other group. So it's a very educated group, but also living in a lot of poverty. And we can assume this has something to do with the fact that it's a highly immigrant group and a lot of refugees coming from areas of the world where they've had their schooling interrupted by war or civil strife. They've had to flee their homes. There's a lot of mental trauma. So we know there's a lot of issues that we can address. We can fix these things, but we don't have the data to do it yet. And so that's why it's important for us to know who our community is and where they are so we can find out what the issues are. And we're a very capable community. We can address them. We just have to know what we're working with.
So there is education, but there's also high poverty at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Well, even within education, what's fascinating is when you take, so right now Arabs and Middle Eastern folks are within the white category. So if you take Arabs out of that category, you see that Arabs are more likely to have a college degree than white people, but they're also less likely to have graduated high school than white people.
How do you take Arabs out of that category?
Great question. So you can't do it on all federal surveys and data, but what you can do is go into a data set called the American Community Survey, which is asked of about 1% of Americans every year. You'll get a call from the census that says, hey, would you like to partake in the American Community Survey? So from that 1% sample of the entire country every year, they also ask what your ancestry is. So yes, they'll put you in the white box, but they'll also record if you say I'm Yemeni, I'm Iraqi, you can say I'm Arabian. They actually count that. You can be Arabian. They count all of that, and you can query the data and say, I want everybody who said there's some sort of Arab, I want to see just that data.
Okay.
And then you can compare it to the larger white
subtract
category.
it from the
you
larger.
take it out. It's called disaggregating.
Okay.
You take it out. And at the Center for Arab Narratives, if you go onto our website and our social media, we do a lot of that. We publish a lot of that data to show you, here's how the Arab identity looks compared to how when people just check the white racial box. And you'll see it's very specific, unique community.
What are some of the question marks that you have other than the education, income paradox? What other like alarming or interesting research have you come across?
So we know from Michigan health surveys that are sent, again, just like you get a phone call, they say, hey, I'm with the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. We'd like to ask you some questions. every couple of years they do this behavioral health risk factor survey where they ask you things like, do you smoke? Do you drink? How often do you see your doctor? And from these surveys, we know that Arab Chaldean and other MENA groups in Michigan have very low rates of cancer screening, meaning they're not going to the doctor, they're not getting screened for cancer. And so what's happening is when they finally catch the cancer, it's so advanced, it's metastasized that, unfortunately, it's harder to treat. So there's a lot of researchers. University of Michigan's Rogel Cancer Center does studies constantly in the community. Why is it that we're not getting screened? Is it cultural barriers? Is it linguistic barriers? Why are we not being screened properly for all these cancers? And so, there's research that's happening, but the more data we have, we might get better answers to those questions.
So that means we might have a higher cancer death rate as well, because most of the cancers that they're catching are in the later stages.
Yeah, there's some research that will be coming out really soon by these young Arab American med students who are just amazing. And they've been working with data from health systems on the cancer screenings versus metastatic cancer rates. And I think we're going to see some sobering information that will hopefully propel our community to see it as an important problem and start to address it.
This episode is sponsored by Whoop. Whoop is a fitness wearable that has changed the way I go about my life. You're always one decision away from improving your life, and this was one of those decisions for me. It provided me with all the information I needed about how my body was reacting to my exercise, the food that I ate, and the sleep that I had. For example, it made me see how different I sleep when I eat something right before bed versus when I don't eat anything at all. Because when you're tracking your sleep every day, it becomes more accessible to pinpoint the variables that affected your sleep. You can try it out for 30 days for free when you visit join.whoop.com/notfromhere. And now, back to the episode. The research that happens, is it strictly medical, or are there some social aspects to it as well? My question is, what kind of research will this open up the door to?
Yeah, great question. Anything you can imagine. So people do research on psychology. What are the mental issues, the mental needs that the community has? Why are they carrying these things? Substance use disorders, domestic violence. There's even been really interesting studies about where people buy their halal food and why. So sociological studies like that. So you can researchers come from all over the country to talk to the Metro Detroit community because it is so big and it is so unique. And so we help facilitate a lot of that research when we think it's worthwhile.
Where do they buy them in terms of what exactly?
So there was a study, and this person surveyed and interviewed over 300 people, Arab Americans in Dearborn and Metro Detroit. And it was what grocery stores do you go to and why, specifically to buy halal food. And it was fascinating because people have loyalty for different, but no one's ever thought to ask those questions before. Right. And so, I didn't think anybody would take this survey. It was by a graduate student out at, I think, Western Michigan University. And people loved the survey. They were sharing it with all their friends and taking the survey because I think people were like, oh yeah, this is a really interesting question that I myself would like to know the answer to. And I don't remember the results specifically, but.
Yeah, but what you're saying about loyalty is a very big thing, because we'll be sitting in gatherings and 5 families would get their meat from 5 different places and will only eat meat from those 5 places.
Oh yeah, they'll fight to the death that this is the only place
and
you
if
should
we
buy
want to
your
eat
meat.
meat, the person that gets meat will get it from my guy and all these things. So yeah, I never even thought about that really.
Yeah, this researcher touched a nerve, I think.
Yeah.
That's good.
And I was asking about the social stuff is because Dr. Christine told me about her research back in Lebanon and how social, your relationships is a form of currency there. That's why people are more social. The gatherings, we like to think about as, the tradition and the culture and all these things, people sit together more. But she told me that it's actually a form of currency because back home, to get further along in society, you need to know a guy. To make it short
You
and
need
sweet.
the wasta, right?
Yeah, wasta, exactly. So the more people you know, the more connected you are, the easier things start to happen, because people don't really rely on the government like they do here. So people need people. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's interesting seeing those types of research here. And what you're saying is the door is open. So in the next 10 years, we're supposed to have enormous amounts of research happening on our communities.
Yeah, because there's these surveys, these federal surveys, and also like state-run surveys and surveys that come out of like University of Michigan or University of Texas. And they ask people all the time, they'll call them up and they ask these questions like, how often do you gather with friends and family? Are you happy? And so we have these social surveys, but none of them ask, are you Arab or MENA? And now if they start doing that, we'll have all of this wonderful data to be able to put into words the things you're saying. I think social relationships are very important in our community. And now we'll be able to say why. And, for things like working with the aging populations, there's folks at Access that work specifically with senior citizens, because oftentimes they get left out of a lot of the programs. And it's not like this in the Arab community, but, people put their elderly relatives into homes and they don't get the social interaction they usually do. And that can have really negative effects for people's health and mental well-being. And so we could study why it works in the Arab community, because there's these huge social networks that take care of our senior citizens.
Right. PTSD, for example, and immigration, like how, like, does it phase off after you're here for some years? There's, like you said, the possibilities are endless when it comes to research. And I think a big problem with people participating in research is they don't know how important it is. Like if someone comes knocking on your door and telling you, hey, would you like to be in this research? Or if I get a phone call personally right now, and the first thing I'm going to look for is if it's a human and what are the 3 words that they're going to say after. If I feel like, oh, it's not someone that I personally know, I'm just going to like,
oh, of course.
Yeah. So it's like, how do you get people to participate? The people that you want to participate.
That is the biggest challenge. And when we help these researchers, we always tell them, like, look, you have lofty goals. You want to speak to 500 Arab Americans in Dearborn. Okay, we'll try. But yeah, you have to build a lot of trust. You can't just go knock on somebody's door and they open it and you're holding a clipboard and you're like, here, tell me who you are, where you were born, what your health issues are. Nobody's going to answer those questions. And so you've got to build a lot of trust. You have to incentivize it. So $20 gift card for taking this survey. And that way you're showing the person that your information is valuable and I'm going to pay you for your information. Because what we do at the Center for Arab Narratives is we help facilitate this research, but then when the research is done, we put it into plain language, the results, and share it back to the community. Because if it wasn't for you and your family and friends answering those surveys, there would be no research. It's called community-based research because you can't do it without the community's assistance. So what we try to do is things like going on this podcast and letting people know why it's so important to participate in this research. Even if it seems a little scary, we would never tell you to put yourself at risk. Always vet the person that's asking you this question, see their credentials, look them up online. If they're coming from Access or coming from the Center for Arab Narratives, you know that we vetted them ahead of time. We only work with trusted partners who we know are going to do good work. And go out on a limb and try something new. I think you'd be amazed the wonderful things we can learn about our community when people are willing to talk and share their stories.
Yeah. Do you find this level of difficulty doing research outside of the Arab community, or is it just the Arab American community that gives you this level of difficulty while doing research?
All communities have their trepidations with working with scientists. Historically, like in the Black community, they've been screwed over so many times by science and the medical community that there's a lot of hesitation in that community. In the Arab community, there's a lot of fear of being surveilled. threats of deportation, threats of will you tell the government the wrong information. So yeah, there's an understandable amount of hesitation in the Arab community to participate in some forms of research. Yeah.
I was going to say that's a lot of people I feel's fear is, oh, this person's coming from the government. He's about to take my information. I'm out of here.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not, even if there is no really, there's no way you're getting deported. You were born here. You know what I mean? But they still have this fear that this person is going to share my information. The government is out for us.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I feel like that's where the real hiccup is.
Yeah. For instance, one of the big initiatives we're working on now is gauging our community's comfort level and understanding of participating in genetic science research. So this is where somebody swabs your cheek or they take a blood sample and then they have your DNA. And that's very scary, right? They've got my DNA. But if we don't get people to participate in that, the medical advances that are happening and helping other communities aren't going to happen for our community.
Yeah.
There's this new wave in the medical field called precision medicine. And with precision medicine, you would go and meet with your doctor or genetic counselor, and they would look at your DNA and say, based on these genetic markers, this medicine will work better than this medicine for diabetes or heart disease, or this treatment might work better based on your genetic makeup. And right now, that data pool of all this genetic material does not include a lot of people from Arab and MENA countries. So we're trying to increase people's participation in that, basically to help cure rare diseases and to move medical science along. And it takes everybody's participation, but we especially need folks from our community to take the risk and be brave and participate.
So we're at the point where the funding is there.
Mm-hmm.
There is money to do all of these things, but you lack the resources to do them.
The funding is there. The will is there. The need is there. And we're slowly building the trust with the community to get them on board. Because again, none of this happens without community members buying into it.
How do you build trust other than the gift cards?
It's time. You meet people where they are. You go to mosques and churches and community centers. You give presentations. We work with the youth. We have a group of high school students who are really into science and want to help the community, and we're training them to go out and talk to the community. It just takes time. It's systemic change. Remember, systemic change takes time. And if we're going to get an entire community that's been left out of the medical data for generations to now be part of it, it just takes a lot of time.
What can you tell us about our community that we don't know?
Oh my! I mean, I can tell you just by sharing my own experience, I think is always novel for folks, that every small town in this country has some level of an Arab community, because they've been coming from Lebanon, Egypt, Morocco, Palestine for 140 years. So I have yet to go to a decent sized small town anywhere in the country where there's not like an old school Lebanese, Syrian, Palestinian community. And so it's fascinating that we always think immigrants want to live in big cities, but that's not true, because immigrants don't always come from big cities. So why would you want to live in New York if you grew up on a farm in Yemen, right? It's just a whole different experience. So there's this huge Yemeni community in Coldwater, Michigan, which is like an hour and a half out in the middle of nowhere. It's a lake town in south central Michigan. And people are like, oh, I can't believe these Yemenis are stuck out in the farms. And when you talk to them, they're like, no, we moved here because of the farmland and the ruralness, because that's what we like. And so you'd be amazed where everyone thinks immigrants, especially Arab immigrants, want to be in big cities, but it's not true.
I think living here, you kind of you don't forget that there's Arabs other than here, but we don't understand the value of having this big of a community where, I'll give you an example. I used to manage an AT&T store, right, a couple years back, and I got this customer that had problems with customer service, and part of the rule in the store was I can't call customer service on your behalf if you're a customer. So I'm like, yeah, you have to call customer service. He was like, can you call them for me? I'm like, we kind of can't do that. And he was like, but I can't speak English. And I'm like, how long have you been here for? And he was like, 40 years. And I'm like, you've been here for 40 years and you still don't know how to speak English? And he was like, no, I never really had to. You will not find that anywhere else in the country.
No. And when I teach about Arab American history, I say that Dearborn is so unique for that reason. As an Arab American in Dearborn, you can expect to leave your house, go to the doctor, dentist, the lawyer, the car dealership, the grocery store, the bank, and never have to speak English if you don't want to. You can't do that anywhere else in the United States. It doesn't exist on that scale. Most Arab Americans do not walk out of their front door and see other Arab Americans. They're the only Arab in their high school. They're the only Arab in their neighborhood. That's a very common experience. So I think that's why researchers come to Dearborn and Detroit, because of the concentration here, but also because it's a very unique experience.
Doesn't that make the research kind of biased when you're doing like these social experiments with Arab community? It's basically a mini Middle East here, you know, rather than going to the rural areas of Pennsylvania and studying the immigrant community over there. It's going to be very different than studying them here, just because we're a mini Middle East right here.
100%. And this is part of the problem with not having the large federal data, because researchers have to rely on what's called convenience samples. You're a single researcher. How many people could you possibly talk to in 6 months, right? Maybe 100, 200. And if you were just traveling rural areas looking for the one Arab here, the one Arab here, it would take you forever. So they come to Metro Detroit because they can do that convenience sample very quickly. But it absolutely skews the research, because not only is there a huge concentration here, you know, there's certain concentrations of populations you don't find elsewhere. Like the Lebanese Shia Muslim population is huge here. There are not huge Lebanese Shia Muslim populations in every other state.
Right.
The Yemeni community, there's only huge Yemeni communities in maybe 3 or 4 cities in the U.S. So yes, coming here is going to get you a very distinct kind of Arabness. And so we always warn researchers, look, when you do your research with this community, make sure when you write up the results, you say you're not generalizing about the entire Arab American experience. You're saying, this is what I learned from the Metro Detroit Arab experience, because it's very different than other parts of the country.
Do you do research only in Michigan?
No, we facilitate research. So most of the researchers we work with are all over the country. They come to Michigan because of the population.
Okay.
But we don't only facilitate research here. So people want to post studies online that anybody can take. We help make sure that those studies are sound and that the survey questions they're asking aren't going to endanger our community or turn off the community. Sometimes they ask questions in a way that we're like, yeah, they're not going to answer this question. You better rephrase this. Yeah. But yeah, we try to make sure that the research is done in an empowering way for the community, and not making them seem like lab mice that they're just trying to extract information from.
Yeah. What are some of the disadvantages that you're going to face in the next? So very big advantage is adding the check, the MENA check. What are some of the disadvantages to that, if any?
I mean, if you really want to sort of get into the weeds on it, I think one of the disadvantages might be that because that box is now there, people who know nothing about our community are going to want to start to study the community, which is okay, right? Ahlan wa sahlan, come learn about us. But they need to take the time to do their research, learn the history, learn the issues, and not just add the MENA community onto their study because it might get them more clout in their field or help their career. And so I'm worried that folks are going to see the data and just start using it without actually thinking about the history of these communities. And like you said, if all the data is in Metro Detroit and then they say, oh, this is how all Arabs in the U.S. think, the data is going to be wrong.
Right. So you're saying people might want to diversify their research portfolio. And they're like, hey, let's do this box next.
Exactly.
Yeah. And if they don't understand the history, they don't understand where these people are coming from, it kind of would affect negatively in the way people look at Arab Americans.
It could, or it could just be incorrect information, or just a part of the story and not the whole story.
Now, the West is very vast. So does this box exist in any other Western country? Maybe in Europe, Canada, maybe South America?
That's a good question. I'm not a scholar outside of the bounds of the U.S., but what I can tell you is the way race is understood in the United States is pretty distinct on the world stage. Canada, maybe Australia are also considered like multicultural societies that for a long time have asked people about their racial identity. But, you know, if you go to like for instance, recent Iraqi and Yemeni immigrants, when they're presented with the form that exists now that says, are you Latino, white, black, Asian, Indian, or other, a big portion of them select that they're Asian.
I used to do that.
Yeah, because when you grew up in your country, you knew that you were on the Asian continent.
Right.
So you come to the U.S. and you're like, well, I'm from Asia, so yes, I'll check Asian.
Yeah.
But you might not realize that in the United States, Asian means something very specific. And so, yes, there's like, you have to understand how race works in the U.S. And so, yeah, it's not exactly the same as other countries. So adding a MENA box elsewhere might not work the same way.
Yeah. And I think that makes a lot of sense because, like you said, in America, it's kind of the norm now to think about it like, okay, this place has everywhere they immigrate to America. In Europe, they're kind of still very cultural, you know. They try to preserve, like if you go to Belgium or you go to Germany, you know, like these places. Let's say Germany is very strict on their culture. They probably wouldn't want to even acknowledge the MENA box. But yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, because, you know, in the U.S., being a hyphenated American is usually celebrated. I'm Italian American, I'm German American, I'm Arab American. But in other places, it's not. You're German, you're French. Doesn't matter where your family came from. We're all the same. Like they try to suppress that sort of ethnic identity. But here in the U.S., we, for the most part, celebrate it.
Why do you think it took 25 years to convince, on a federal level, that this should happen?
Oh boy, this could be a whole nother podcast. But really, again, the federal government does not move quickly, as you could understand. They move very slowly. And also, now that we have this box, right, the MENA box, it's going to extract a certain percentage of people from the white category, which means that the white population in the U.S. will now be seen in smaller numbers than it ever has.
Okay.
And I think people are afraid of admitting that we now live in a majority-minority society where when you add up the Latinx, the Black, the Asian, the Indigenous, and the Arab and MENA communities, when you add them up together, they're much greater than the white racial box. So I think people were a little nervous to actually see the data support that idea.
Are there any other minorities that are included in the white box, or is it just the MENA community?
I mean, it depends what you identify as a minority. Right now, Armenians are still in the white box. They're not considered MENA by the federal government, although a lot of the Armenian community does consider themselves MENA. So there are some other groups that kind of want to see themselves differently, but you know, that's a fight for another day, and we're willing to make those changes.
Do you feel like it's more difficult for people to, like, let's say, Matthew, you were on the street and you were telling people like, hey, we're doing this research, this and that. Do you think because you're fourth generation, there might be some like obstacles and people giving you that trust? Like, no, Matthew's Abyad, he's white, you know?
Well, and I don't speak Arabic well enough to ask somebody in Arabic. I don't present physically as someone who would instantly be picked as Arab American. So yes, that could cause a barrier. But let's say I'm coming as a researcher from the University of Michigan or Harvard University. I'm at Harvard University and I'm doing this study. That kind of mitigates some of that because they're like, oh, I've heard of Harvard.
Credible.
That's a great school. Yeah. So it's about credibility. And yes, I'm not just going to walk up to someone on the street and expect them to engage with me on that level, because we also live in a society where when someone comes up to you on the street, you're immediately suspect.
Yeah.
Is this person going to ask me for money? Are they going to harm me? Like, we just don't talk to random people on the street in our society, right?
He's from the FBI.
Yeah, exactly. He's got a clipboard. He's got to be CIA. So yeah, it's a difficult way to do research. So that's why these individual researchers, instead of walking the street with a clipboard, they come to Access, they come to other groups and say, can we put a table in one of your offices? Can you send an email out to your clients? Like, so it's a way to work with trusted organizations instead of, being the person with a clipboard that gets, accosted on the street.
While you were studying, while you were in school studying, what part of like the Arabic culture kind of attracted you and you were like, oh, I was never familiar with this?
I think, the language, I studied the language in school. I grew up like hearing it, but I didn't really know a lot about it. I knew only a few words. So just, being around people that speak it fluently is always intriguing. I think hearing people speak their native language is always so fascinating, regardless of what language it is. The different kinds of food. So I grew up with a very specific kind of Levantine cuisine, and coming to Dearborn and trying all the different kinds, like even going to a Lebanese restaurant here and being like, I've never heard of this food. I don't even know what this is because it's, regional. That always intrigued me. So I've done a lot of research on food and how food and identity sort of coalesce together.
You did research on food and identity?
Yeah. So a lot of the studies I did, I don't do medical research. I have a PhD in the humanities. So I looked at the history of restaurants, Arab American restaurants, and how they developed into what we know today. Because, at some point somebody had to sit down and think of all the food that Arabs have. Which ones are the white people going to like?
Yeah.
Right? Which foods should we serve in the restaurant?
Which ones are going to make the most profit?
Exactly. And so when you go to a restaurant today, there's very specific foods that are available, and that menu looks very similar to a menu in Los Angeles or New York. And that's because people are trying to make money. It's not just about selling food, it's about making money. And so decisions are made around taste, ingredients, recipes, and then how you market it, right? Outside of Dearborn, in communities where there's not a lot of Arab Americans, the restaurants always tend to have very exotic names, right? Like Sinbad or Alibaba, Aladdin. These are the names of the restaurants. But in Dearborn, it's not usually like that. The restaurants are like the person's name or very descriptive of the kind of food they are, because they're not trying to exoticize it.
Right.
Because there's so many Arabs that live here.
So you did the research on Dearborn or on American?
Nationally.
Nationally.
Yeah. In fact, I didn't do much on Dearborn because the restaurant scene here is very specific.
Yeah. So what are some other things you found in that research?
I found that, Arabs have used restaurants in the U.S. for over 100 years as a way to convince Americans to not be afraid of them. Because outside of the post 9/11 environment, Arabs were not always the most desirable immigrants in the U.S., right? A lot of people didn't want them here. Their language is weird. Their food is weird. We don't know anything about them. And so even as far as like 100 years ago in New York City, restaurant owners would advertise their food in a way that would bring in non-Arabs to just learn a little bit about who they are. Don't be afraid of us. Come try this food. Come listen to our music. And so restaurants were a very key component of Arabs building rapport with the greater community. Wow. And it still functions that way too. There's a lot of people that come to Dearborn who are a little wary of, especially coming to such a big Muslim community, but they come to the restaurants and then they're like, oh, this place is great. I want to learn more. I want to research more. And so foods are a great, food in restaurants is a wonderful entry point for people to learn about a different culture.
Yeah. And especially in our culture, the Arab culture, it's food's a very big deal to where if I have a guest coming over, and I know this guest coming to eat, I'm gonna go all out.
Oh yeah.
I don't want this person to be like, you're going to leave this table almost about to explode with the amount of food that I'm gonna feed you.
Yeah.
And I think that translates a lot to the restaurant owners as well, because they're gonna have that mentality as well. And you see a lot of restaurants here, when a non-Arab person walks in, a lot of the times they tend to over offer.
Yeah.
They try to give them more than what they asked for. Here, try this or this or that. They want to show like this beautiful part of our culture of, we're very welcoming. Here's some more.
Yeah, the hospitality.
Yeah,
is
the
big.
hospitality.
I mean, it's not, it's in some ways it's a stereotype, like, Arabs are very hospitable, but in actuality, it is something the community carries with them and really takes a lot of pride in. And you do see it in restaurants. Now, some restaurants don't care to have
Absolutely
non-Arab clientele. I've been in some restaurants where they're like, we know who comes here.
Yeah.
We don't need these other people coming here, and they're not as welcoming, and that's fine. And I think that's really interesting that they're very happy with their own clientele and they're very comfortable with it. But for the most part, restaurants are very welcoming to non-Arabs, because
and that can also only happen here. If restaurants open in California, they need to make sure that non-Arabs are visiting the restaurant as well. It will only happen here, to where a restaurant owner wouldn't care if a white person or a black person or a Latino comes in or not.
Yeah, they don't need that extra revenue. They got enough money coming in just from their own community.
Right.
Yeah.
Matthew, when it comes, you've been exposed to the Arab community a lot through your research, right? And I still find it very intriguing. Why in the world is a fourth generation Lebanese immigrant so passionate about the community? I can't understand it. Like, it's very difficult for me to understand.
I don't even know if I can verbalize it any more than it's a way for me to stay connected to my heritage. It's a way for me to think about when my great-grandparents came and didn't speak English, what they would have gone through, right? How people might have treated them, and to see that they persevered, not just because of who they were, but because there was a community, right? They weren't the only Lebanese immigrants. There was a handful of families that worked together, and they helped support each other. And so I see that happening in Dearborn. I see that happening in other Arab communities. And so I think, it's a way for me to sort of see history happening. I can think about how my ancestors did it and then see people doing it now. And it's just fascinating to me.
It is very fascinating. And I think if we do a research right now on the whole community and see how many people in the community care what their great grandparents went through, I think would be very little. So that's why I think it's even more interesting to me that although we like to say that heritage is very important to us, our lineage is very important to us, but great-grandparent, most people don't know the names of their great-grandparents.
Yeah, very far removed.
Then that's on the contrary of what you're doing, is that not only do you know their names, but you're grasping on 100 plus years ago what happened and trying to implement it in your life today. I think it's fascinating.
Yeah, and again, like you asked me about my other family members and my sister, I think they carry that with them. They have this understanding. They know they come from this culture, but I think I just took it to a whole nother level. And I think that's also because I'm fascinated by history. I mean, that's why I became a historian, just I'm always thinking about the past and where we're at.
As you mentioned all these things, we've talked about all these things. If you were to teach your children one aspect of the Arab culture, what would it be?
That's interesting, because I have a 9-year-old and a 5-year-old, and I always think about this because, they don't really know their Arab heritage yet. They're kind of young, and they're very picky eaters. I haven't been able to get them to eat the good stuff yet. I think I want them to know the history. I want to know that the community is always fighting, not just for itself, but for others. You know, I just earlier today gave a presentation to Arab Americans who work in a federal relief agency, and I gave a history of Arab American activism. And it's really fun to show people that ever since our ancestors got here in the 1890s, early 1900s, they were active. They were fundraising. They were building community centers. They were handing out money to the poor, not just in their own community, but other communities. And then they started running for office. And so like there's a history there that we don't often think about and recognize. And what we're seeing today with this fight for Palestine is on a scale we've never experienced, but it didn't come out of nowhere. Right? It came out of the fact that Arab Americans have been involved in activism and social justice for 4 or 5 generations.
Yeah. Let's say you're in charge of doing research on one aspect of life of the Arab community, and you know that people are going to participate, but you get to choose. You have what are you most interested in knowing about our community?
I mean, this answer probably changes every year because I meet researchers who are doing such amazing work, and I'm like, I want to get the answer to that for you.
Yeah.
But right now, my big thing is, as I mentioned, getting more Arab and MENA folks to submit their DNA profiles for precision medicine. And the reason is I went to this convening in California, and it was funded by the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. So Chan Zuckerberg is the wife of Mark Zuckerberg, the Facebook guy, and she's a pediatrician. And she sent all this money up to fund science into rare diseases. So people that have a disease, you know, oh, this person, only 1 in 700,000 people get this disease. And so there's all these diseases that people have, and they're usually based on genetic mutations. And the more genetic material that scientists have to study, the more likely is they're going to find a cure for these diseases. So when I was at this conference and I was telling people, I'm trying to get Arab and MENA folks to participate in genetic data collection, some of these parents of children with rare diseases would get so emotional. Like, this is such important work because the more different kinds of genetic material scientists have to study, the more likely they are to find a cure. And so I know it seems like, you know, up in the clouds to have that kind of like, oh, we can cure rare diseases. Well, we really can cure rare diseases because our community is so understudied right now that if we participate and scientists can say, hey, there's this profile of MENA DNA and add that into the fight against these diseases, who knows what can happen.
Genetic precision medicine.
Precision medicine, genetic data collection, genetic sciences. There's many different names for it, but you know, I think it's the wave of the future. It's already happening, and I want to make sure our community is not left out.
I'm just thinking about all the problems that can be solved through research, and I wouldn't think of precision medicine or genetic data collection as one of them. You said you've gotten people over the years that come and want to do research, and you get excited. What are some of those things?
When they're trying to really find out issues and solve issues.
Okay.
And, you know, the cancer screening one is big. There's a new project we're getting ready to work on with a professor from Wayne State University, this Arab American guy, and he wants to get Arab American men to do colorectal cancer screenings. And he wants to go to barbershops and hang out in barbershops and talk to people about why you shouldn't be nervous about getting colon cancer screening because we're seeing alarming rates in young people. And so, yeah, I mean, I would support that work, you know, because you can really feel that there's an urgency. And this guy, you know, is a cancer survivor himself, and he's driven. You can see, and you're like, this guy's going to make it happen, and I would like to be on that team.
Okay, I see what you're saying. How can we help? How can the average listener help?
I think if you see a study, if you see a flyer posted that says, hey, participate in this study, just take a second thought about it. Again, I'm not forcing people to do something they're not comfortable with, but just think about, you might not think that you have anything to offer, but let's leave that up to the professionals, right? Participate. Sometimes they just do a screening survey where they ask you 3 questions just to see if you even fit with the study. And if you don't, you don't. Let's go about your day, whatever, you tried. But I think that's what we need people to do, is to see that an individual Arab American has some power, and they can use that power to help change science and medical research and other kinds of research.
Especially right now, after you said last month they added that box, I think that should incentivize people to at least try to tick the box, at least to tick the box.
Exactly. That's the easiest thing you can do, is if you see yourself as part of the Arab or MENA community, to check that box when you see it.
Yeah. What's one thing that we didn't talk about today that you think we should have?
Oh my gosh. I think we covered it all, but I think one thing we didn't talk about is within Dearborn, the food scene is so huge, and the changes that have happened. Just, I've been working in Dearborn for 14 years now. And when I got here, it was right at the beginning of the burger craze. Everybody's opening a burger restaurant. Then the Yemeni coffee shop craze and the hot chicken craze. And I think these might just seem like funny pop culture moments, but there's something to be studied there. Why are certain types of community members, certain ages, certain generations interested in certain kinds of businesses? Why are certain parts of the community interested in certain kinds of food? And I think it's really fun to see the food scene here, which is more vibrant than anywhere. I mean, there's not a more vibrant Arab American food scene anywhere than in Dearborn and the surrounding areas. And I think there could be some cool research done on that.
Yeah, I was having a conversation similar to this with my friend the other day, and you see the food scene is a very good way to look at it. They're very good examples. There's also another part of, you see how many real estate agents there are in this area, how many mortgage people. And I was asking this person, I'm like, is this only here or is this all over the country? And they were like, no, it's specifically here. There's way more of these professions than other places. And we started to think, why is that? And a lot of it comes, I might get my head chopped off for this, but people are unoriginal. There's a lot of unoriginality. A lot of, I see that Matthew's doing this. He's well off. Let me do this just because I have a family to feed and we already took the risk. We came back from overseas. This is working here. Let me just do it. I think not all of it, part of it is the taking the risk and coming up with something original. And I understand that it's difficult, especially in the food scene, to be original when there's 1,000,001 places to go eat and 1,000,001 concepts. But just maybe it's safe. Let me do it. Maybe.
I think that's an aspect of it. And I think, there's always fads. There's always pop culture fads, food fads. But let me spin it slightly differently to take it back to this idea of social capital and the wasta. Like, somebody opens a successful burger joint, and then their cousin's like, hey, help me open a burger joint. And then a friend is like, I know somebody that has a burger joint. So part of it is like, I wouldn't say it's being unoriginal. I think it's working the social capital that you have.
Yeah.
And it gets to the point where it's like, okay, another place. Yeah. But like, you can roll your eyes at it. But yeah, you can see that it's happening because of the social connections in the community.
Yeah.
And again, it's fascinating to watch in real time to see it happening.
I mean, I think that could be the social aspect can be a very big part of it as well. But I agree with you. It is something to be studied, and to where, why is it like that? Why don't you open, if you're franchising your store, why are you opening 5 different stores within a 20-mile radius rather than franchising outside of of the state or the area that we're in. I don't know. It is something to be studied, definitely. But other than that, Matthew, thank you so much for coming. I really, really enjoyed that conversation. I feel like this won't be the last time that we sit down together.
I would love to keep talking about research and promoting the work that's happening in the community. Thank you for having me, allowing me to share my story, and it's great meeting you.
Of course. Thank you.